Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? A teenage girl who was having an asthma attack while she was at someone's house she wasn't supposed to be at. My mom's gonna kill me. She died at the hospital. I'm an emergency nurse, and there's one thing that always gets me when patients die. Not what they say, but what their husband, wife, parents say when they've gone. I've had it a few times, but the most memorable was a man in his 70s whose wife had just passed away, and he was holding her hand and crying, and he just looked up at me and said, "I've loved her for 55 years, she's my whole life. What do I do without her?" It breaks me every time. Edit. Wow, I didn't expect so much outpouring of love and support here. And I certainly didn't expect to earn silver and gold from this. I've read all of your replies, and cried through many of them. Those of you who are nurses or love nurses, thank you. This job takes a piece of you every time. And for those who have needed nurses, thank you for making those pieces worthwhile. I would love if you would all come and share some of your stories on my blog, nursenocturnal.com. It's super early days for the blog and I haven't figured out formatting yet, but you're all welcome to come and post some of your experiences and knowledge there. Nurse in hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor, coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, response to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine, and she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. My husband is a PICU nurse, and one morning he came home in a bit of a daze. I asked him what was wrong and he told me about a little boy who had been in PICU for a few days already and wasn't getting better. Most nights, the little boy would wake up, so one of the nurses would keep him company while he fell asleep again. My husband was doing just that. He read him a book, then just sat there with the boy listening to music so he would go back to sleep. Before falling asleep, the little boy said, "You were my favorite." The boy passed away in the morning. His little heart gave out and refused to restart. Although all patients are important, some leave more of an impression than others. Until that point, that little boy hadn't stood out to my husband, and he felt terrible about it because, clearly, he had made a big impression on that little boy. That was the only patient's funeral he has ever attended. Edit. Thank you so much everyone for your amazing replies. I have passed along your love and gratitude to my husband. Actually read him some comments and he blushed and got all bashful. Thank you to those who gave this comment silver, golds and platinum. Since my husband did not receive these prices, I went and bought him a PSN card so he can spend on his games and made him his favorite for dinner. Sweet guy in his 20s with endocarditis, heart valve infection caused by IV drug abuse. I was prepping him for his third open heart surgery when he sat up, looked me in the eye, and said, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" He did not survive the surgery. It wasn't words, but the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle, and her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed, and a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You're not alone. We're right here with you. It's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow, and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. When I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly and I was called to his room to help while on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed intubated. I explained all this to him and that I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die." I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU. A few weeks later I was on call covering the ICU and he was barely hanging on. I knew he would not make it through the night. He went into VFib several times and I was able to bring him back, but only briefly. He was just too sick and he died shortly after that. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them knowing the last words he ever spoke were to me saying, "Please don't let me die." Nursing home. Most elderly people are at ease as they get nearer and nearer to death. But this old lady, as she deteriorated over her last week or so, would scream, "I don't want to die, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, I don't want to die." Really heartbreaking to see. With wide eyes, don't listen to my family, they want to keep me around forever but I just want to die. They won't let me. Edit. She wanted to get off dialysis, which was a death sentence for her. I was visiting my grandpa and had to leave town and go back to medical school, and I told him I loved him and would see him later. He told me he loved me too, but no, I wouldn't. He was right, he died a week later of pneumonia. Not the very last words, but I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days. Asked me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would bust into tears but no, she just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. RN here. I don't remember this guy's admitting diagnosis, he wasn't assigned to me, but my coworker asked me to help start an IV on him. He needed a unit of blood and his peripheral access had gone bad. I placed a tourniquet and was ready to stick, then he looked at me and said, "I'm dying." Immediately went unresponsive. I checked his pupils. I watched one dilate and the other constrict. We coded him. Never got him back. Hospice nurse here had a patient who was experiencing terminal agitation. With an expression of complete terror on his face he said, "Help me. They are coming to get me. Can I smoke in here?" We were on an ambulance. I'm an intern at a home for patients with Alzheimer's and have only been there for a few weeks. The first patient to pass during my internship said, "Who am I?" For some reason it saddens me deeply and I can't seem to let it go. I'm an EMT. Had a patient say, "I don't feel so good," right before they dropped dead of a massive heart attack. It was just a matter of fact way they said it. My goddamn twat is cold. Tough 86-year-old bird with orange hair, white roots and tattoos. Last word spoken while having groin prepped with cold soap for cardiac catheterization. Not a medic. My friend's brother committed suicide. He hung himself in his closet while she watched TV in the living room. The last thing he said before going upstairs was, "I'm going to rest." That weirded her out because he never spoke like that. Not haunting, but it went, so this is what retirement is like. He got hit by a car within a few days of retirement and it has to be the funniest last words. Normally they are sad last words. Edit. Thanks for the silver and wow, didn't expect this to blow up like this. not a medical worker, but when I was 14 my friends and I were joking around before our 7th period theater class. My one friend, who was always a big goof, was playing along with a joke that he and another classmate were breaking up and said, "This relationship is over." Then spun around and fell to the floor for dramatic effect. Except it wasn't for dramatic effect, because he actually suffered heart failure and died instantly from an unknown condition, acute myocarditis. None of us realized it and laughed along. I even picked up his glasses from the floor and put them on to tease him about how blind he was. When I tried to give him his glasses back I was struck by how discolored his face was, and then blood began to pour from his mouth. That's when the screaming started. Absolutely fed me as a 14-year-old to realize we could all just drop dead at any moment. "I'm going home tonight, so I won't see you tomorrow, bye." Damn if she wasn't right. My pop died of lung cancer. The last lucid thing he did was wake up just long enough to sing "Show Me the Way to Go Home." I'm tired and I want to go to bed. I had a little drink about an hour ago and it went right to my head. It was really pretty amazing and freaky at the same time. F cancer. Edit. Wow, my first gold. Thanks for the glitter and all the kind words. My sincerest condolences to everyone who has lost someone to this horrible disease. Dad was over 80 and had smoked for a lot of his life. I still miss him, but he lived a long life and his time had come. I've lost a couple of friends who are my age to cancer and those deaths are much harder to accept. He was a foot soldier in WWII and he sang that song while marching through Germany, I believe. It's not words that haunt me. It's the last few agonal breaths, gasping and gurgling, before they are gone. I still remember the first patient I lost as we stood by as per patient family request. Haunting. Not a medical worker, but I went with my father to say goodbye to my great-uncle, his uncle. He was suffering from dementia and clearly on the way out. He no longer recognized people. My father was an only child, and spent most of his time being raised by his uncles, as his father ran a farm all day. Anyway, we're sitting there, and great-uncle is snoozing. He suddenly wakes up and clearly sees my father and starts talking to him about a barn and describing it in great detail. Like, he's talking about where it is, the way the paint was flaking off in one corner, and so on. My father is quieter than normal and just saying yes over and over as he describes the barn. Then, just before great-uncle loses consciousness, he describes going into the barn and setting it on fire. Turns out that my grandfather and great-uncle were having a hell of a dispute at one time and burned down the barn to get back at him. Everyone suspected, but never knew for sure. Edit. Looks like I forgot the last words. Most of them were mumbles, but he spoke about how the fire lit up the night and how it took a while to catch. Had a patient on the cardiac ICU during my second month of intern year who had newly diagnosed heart failure that we couldn't figure out what caused it. He was a healthy guy. In his 60s. Did yoga every day, walked a few miles 5 days a week. Genuinely nice guy, which is always a bad prognostic sign. With his heart failure, his heart was so stretched out and not squeezing adequately to provide the blood and subsequent oxygen he needs to the rest of his body. A few nights into his hospital stay, I come in the next morning and discover that the senior resident had to code him for sustained unstable heart arrhythmia, unstable V-touch. I went and talked with him about it the next morning and he told me that he was in and out of consciousness during it all, from the low blood pressure, but he compared it to the feeling of jumping out of the plane and skydiving. Later that morning I was checking on him again and he didn't look so good. He goes into the arrhythmia again, drops his blood pressure, and is in and out of consciousness. As I'm charging the defibrillator to shock him again, he comes back around to him briefly and asks me if I'm taking him sky diving again and lets out a nervous laugh before losing consciousness. Not a medical worker, but my friend's husband was dying from cancer. He'd done lots of chemo and one surgery, and overall his prognoses looked really good. He'd gone through another surgery, and he was due to be released from the hospital a couple days after the story takes place. My friend had been with him and was going back home to sleep for the night. Just before she left his room, he said, "I'm going to miss you, my love," and obviously she thinks nothing of it, saying, "I'll miss you too. I'll be back in the morning." Couple hours later, he was gone. As a pediatrician, I don't hear a lot of last words. What I can never forget is the inconsolable, grief-stricken cries of the parents when I tell them their child has passed away. It's the hardest part of my job. I'm gonna F you all up. Old man who never attended his dialysis appointments. A few hours later, we had a fire right by his former room. So despite not being all that worrying at the time, he definitely was the only one that followed through on actually haunting us. My buddy who went on to be a doctor had an elderly female patient, probably 90 to 100 years old. Her daughter left the room to get coffee and my buddy had to check on her vitals. They were normal. Then she woke up, smiled and got teary-eyed. She said, "I knew you'd come back for me. I'm sorry I died and marry you. My family won't let me. But I will now, I promise." My buddy just held her hand and smiled. She laid back and closed her eyes and her heart stopped. She had a DNR and was gone just like that. Her daughter had no clue what she meant. Her husband had been dead for 10 years and they were married since they were 20. My buddy doesn't know if it's relevant, but we are black and maybe she was in love with a black guy a long time ago. Because she was looking right at him when she spoke. It's weird. Obligatory not a medical worker boy. Famous author Roald Dahl had planned his last words to be, "You know I'm not frightened. It's just that I will miss you all so much," to his family. Instead, the nurse injected him with morphine to relieve his pain and his last words turned out to be, "Ow, fuck." I was with my father as he lay dying in the hospital. It was a long and emotionally exhausting process, so we kids took turns sitting with him and holding his hand for when he would wake up. He was in and out of lucidity, but just before he went he opened his eyes, gripped my hand hard, looked me in the eye and said, "I don't like that guy in the black suit sitting over in the corner." My blood ran cold and I quickly looked over my shoulder and there was an empty chair there. I don't know if he was remembering some incident from his past, hallucinating, or if he saw someone more sinister. I didn't mention it to my siblings for years and even since then they don't like to talk about it. Having surgery tomorrow. What the F am I doing here? Edit. You are all super kind, wonderful people and I will almost certainly not haunt any of you if I kick the bucket tomorrow. Edit 2. Surgery went well. I am home and resting. For the record, my not final words were as follows. Anesthesiologist, we're giving you the anesthesia now, you'll be asleep in just a few seconds. Me, stoned on the don't panic drug cocktail, okay. Sweet dreams honey. Everyone else in operating room, ha 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 ha. So I went under to the sound of laughter. Not a bad deal at all. Again, thank you all for your kind words and encouragement. I was about 5 or 6 when my grandfather was on his deathbed. The last thing he did was put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No wonder you never liked my spicy food." And then he passed about 10 seconds later. We were all super confused. About 3 months later I almost died from suffocation after eating some salsa. At the hospital I was diagnosed with a capsaicin allergy, spicy food. To this day it still creeps me out. No one knew I was allergic before then, and I didn't show any signs either. I work as a PA for a clinic, so I'll never be involved in that situation, but I know a friend who has been. She is also a PA and was helping the guy who was terminally ill. Before he passed, he asked her to not let his wife have his S. Of course she listens and is sympathetic. A day or so after he passed, his ex-wife apparently shows up to the hospital with several kids saying she is in this guy's will. Long story short, she was trying to take his S. Less haunting and more just sad because of how young he was and how he was unaware of his final moments. Mommy, why were you crying? I see the man in the corner again, and number X200B, there was no one, but she'd been seeing a dark man in the corner for days and asking about him. Toward the end, this was all she talked about aside crying for her mother. Cancer wasn't his last words, but last words he said to me, and number X200B, I am an EMT, and we had a frequent patient, almost once a week. He was a huge D, but towards the end he turned into a sweet and appreciative man. We were in his house, which would ended up being out last day there. He knew it. I didn't. He said, can I just have a beer before we leave for the hospital? I didn't let him have it. I should have. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to get more of the best posts.